welcome again, and welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks. So I'm the Global Trade Compliance Director at Riverbed Technology, but today I'm just repping myself and Soma in general. We're right up the street. If you have any questions about Riverbed, come up and talk to me later. But anyway, who's ready for a regulatory briefing? Yeah, no, I'm going to make this super quick so we can get to the interesting stuff. Oh, where we go. So we're going to focus narrowly. This doesn't cover everything. We're going to talk about export controls on cryptographic source code, particularly open source. We're not going to get into IP licensing, anything like that, but that's, of course, something that you want to think about when you're using this stuff. Can you hear me? OK. So some legal disclaimers. I'm not your lawyer. This is informational only. And when you see that symbol at the bottom, that means it's time to call Saul Goodman for obvious reasons. Yeah, and please don't confess anything. Not with the cameras running. So, hey, wait a minute. My code just makes calls to a crypto library that's freely available online. Does the US government still consider my code to be cryptographic? Yes, sorry, that's an easy one. But I only use the standard algorithms. What are the thresholds for strong encryption that mean I'm covered by the regulations? And unfortunately, they're all quite low and they're all quite old. Basically, anything greater than 56 bits for a symmetric algorithm, anything greater than 512 for asymmetric, 112 for EC. So what this means is that if you're using basically any kind of data encryption, you're probably captured in this by these regulations. But are you an exporter? And again, the answer is probably yes. If you share the code out, sorry about that. If you share the code outside the US, also if you make the source code available inside the US to a non-US person, that's someone who's on an H-1B, that's someone who's on a student. Yes, that is, again, this is the stuff that keeps me employed. Don't laugh too hard. Then you're an exporter. So yeah, probably. This is dumb. I'm going to move to a country with less restrictive controls. Okay, but FYI, these thresholds, the U.S. is more strict on sort of internal in-country sharing, but around the world, the same thresholds and the same rules about what constitutes cryptographic code apply. I actually just got, France is terrible in particular. I just got back from Singapore, where they actually, they spent a whole day with us talking about distributing our products from there because they consider our products to be strategic. And the same kind of nomenclature and the same rules apply. There's a multilateral arrangement that I won't bore you with, but that's where all these countries are basically finding the same information. So here's a table, and we're going to try to focus on this part of it right here. We're going to try to fill in these boxes. Basically, the type of availability for your code on the left, the type of item you have up top that will tell you essentially what the rules are. And again, most of the stuff is more than could fit into a 10-minute presentation. If you're making mobile apps, you're over here. You've got registration, reporting, and record keeping. But if you're open source, then we're going to figure out what that means and why it makes sense to talk about object code and source code together. We'll fill in those boxes. So, is your code open source? Legally open source, in terms of the export control regulations, doesn't have any, it's not a term of art, it doesn't have any specific meaning. Publicly available is the relevant term, and that means that it's available for download without restriction. In other words, you're not trying to keep it from your competitors or something like that. You're not running credit checks. And it has to be free of charge, or it can be available for essentially a low price that covers distribution. So if you've got something up and you want to just the cost of running a server or something like that, that would count. Printed publication would also work. That would get you into this publicly available category where you end up with less restrictions than you would have if you were selling through enterprise or distributing through an app store or something like that. The good news is if your code qualifies as publicly available, it doesn't have to go through all that app store process that would go for consumer mass market products. The perhaps surprising news is that you have to send an email to the NSA. You may or may not know this. I know, it's, yeah, right? They should already know, right? Where do we go here? Oh, here we go. Yes, I do, okay. Really, so really, yeah, you actually have to do this. This is coming right out of the federal regulations, and again, I read these so you don't have to. That's what I tell the people I work with. And really what you're supposed to do is you can send them the URL, excuse me, or you can send them a copy of the code. That's probably overkill. They really only need the URL. They know how to download it if you get that to them. And so here's they've got this lovely language right here. If you move it around, you have to tell them, but once you've told them where it is, if you change the code, as long as it's in the same place, you don't have to keep telling them, that every time you make a little change. And yeah, so you CC the Department of Commerce, and so here's the Department of Commerce email address, and here is the NSA email address. Literally, yes, that is the rule. And again, just to go back, these are the steps that are required if you qualify for this open source rule, which is, again, the legal term of art is publicly available. So, I told you this was going to be quick. We've essentially filled in these two boxes now. If it's publicly available source code, you need to send an email. And the other good news is the corresponding object code is not covered by the EAR at all. So your source code is controlled if it's publicly available, but again, the rules are very relaxed. The corresponding object code, completely exempt from the EAR, which is cool. And then we have two wildcards. I wanted to leave you with these because I honestly thought these rules would be out by now, and I've been waiting for them, but they haven't come out. They were adopted in that multilateral regime in December of 2013. Some of you may have heard of them, but there's going to be forthcoming controls on intrusion software. We're not quite sure what that's going to mean in a US context, and there's going to be forthcoming controls on IP network surveillance systems. And so again, these things are going to be defined based on their functionality, and so we're still not sure what this is going to mean for open source software, whether it has crypto or not. So going back to that first slide where I said, I'm not your lawyer, and 6 months from now, this may change. There might be new rules that apply to your open source software. So maybe I'll come back and update or something like that. But this could literally come out tomorrow. It's been six or 7 months since it was adopted internationally. It's already effective in the EU. But the US always adds some kind of special features or wrinkles. And so we're all sort of, people like me anyway, are very eagerly awaiting what this is going to look like. So, questions? Talk to that guy. Oh, sorry. Do we have time for questions? I know I was only, okay.
So the two wildcards, the two paragraphs descriptions didn't mention crypto. So if you're writing software that doesn't really do crypto, but I don't know in truth what these things might be, but general purpose software that might do that, then you qualify for this restriction.
So yeah, again, we honestly don't know. They might exempt open source software entirely from these controls. That would be great. They might make no kind of exemption based on distribution. So just going back to this table, the encryption regulations in the United States make big distinctions based on essentially how it's distributed, right? If you've got fewer restrictions if it's a consumer product, more if it's enterprise, significantly more if you're designing it for a military application. We don't, again, at this point, we just don't know for either of these what kind of allowances they will make for different types of distribution.
So if you have an open source project on, say, GitHub,
Right.
and it has a static page served over github.io, that has recently changed to HTTPS only, or well, HTTPS by default. Does that count?
So in that case, you could just maybe when you send in your first email, just omit, the first part of the URL, just include the www or start with GitHub, right? So
HTTPS does count if you serve any web application.
so here's the thing. So this gets into where to go. This gets into risk analysis when you're, how many. So this has been on the books for many years. How many people know someone who's actually gotten in trouble for this? Right. Neither have I. This is what the rule is, and so especially if you're working at a bigger company, this is what they will tell you to do. But in terms of actual enforcement, it's pretty low. At the same time, what you're running the risk here is that you're giving them some kind of leverage over you. They can say, if you find yourself in a conversation with enforcement, they can say, oh, you should have done this and you didn't. Therefore, we can impose some kind of conditions on you or something like that. So going back to your question. I don't think it would be really necessary just to, for HTTP to HTTPS. I don't think that would trigger essentially the re-notification requirement. There's sort of a judgment call aspect to it, but by the letter, this is literally the letter of the law that we have. You're looking at it, so I don't think so, but it certainly wouldn't hurt if you did.
Did GitHub just start doing that?
As a service, no, that would be great. Yeah.
Is GitHub doing that, by the way?
You'd have to ask GitHub. Okay.
How
Yeah.
about the is complicated section? Is there any, what's one sort of,
Oh.
What's one complicated, interesting thing for enterprise
Sure. So this would be, just to clarify, this would be exclusively enterprise. In other words, if you have a product that is also distributed through a consumer channel, then you get all these privileges, even if you're also going through an enterprise channel. This is getting, like I was saying, a little bit more complicated. But here, you have different rules based on who your customer is and in what country they're in. Here you have the same thing, and then you also have a set of the deemed export controls, where it's inside the United States, who you're sharing your source code with becomes an issue.
What's the difference between an actual enterprise and consumer mass market?
It's complicated. So I should send you my hourly rate. It's literally, there's a set of criteria. It would take at least probably half an hour to walk you through. There's a set of 4 of them. I can talk to you later, but essentially what they're looking for is something that's really like, either off the shelf or point and click purchase. Something where you don't have to have a support contract, something where the user can just take it, it works. It's meant for an individual to use, that kind of thing. That's a very broad strokes, and there are a few technical restrictions that they impose on it, but that's at a high level. That's the distinction.
Why is enterprise source code more complicated than enterprise object code, especially when there is this currency in the US grounds about, let's say, source code is free speech or such languages?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend testing that. I don't know if EFF's in the room, but oh, there you are. Hey, no, yeah. So the good news is that there's on the source code side, in terms of the intra-US sharing of source code, they've mostly, depending on your product, but in most cases they've whittled it down to just the 5 embargo countries. So if you had a national of Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Sudan, or Syria, in that case you would have you'd have an issue with your source code if you had someone on H-1B from one of those countries. In terms of the free speech issue, once you're actually exporting it, though, once you're actually exporting it outside of the country, that essentially nullifies the free speech issue. Unfortunately, the government considers that an export of an item. It's a foreign policy issue. Again, if you can test it and overturn it, Godspeed, sir. But yeah, talk to EFF.
Okay, all right, thanks,
Great.
Jonathan. Just a show of hands, has anybody emailed the NSA about, we have 1, we have 2, okay. These people read the rules.